We're involved in a series of messages entitled How to Ruin Your Life. There's some notes that are involved, or that are inserted rather in your program. If you want to pull those out, it might help you follow along. The first week we talked about the mistake of resisting authority, and we used the umbrella to try to depict this idea, this picture that when you're under the umbrella of God's protection, that's just where you find yourself, protected. Just like in a storm, if you're under the umbrella, you're not going to get wet. But if you move the umbrella to one side, you expose yourself to the storms of life. When we remove ourselves from the authority of God, we expose ourselves from the storms of life as well. It's not that God doesn't like us. It's not that we're unlucky or these kinds of things. We just expose ourselves to the natural consequences of ignoring God's counsel and His covering when we reject the authority that He brings into our lives. Then we talked about the mistake number 2 is this idea of living for yourself, where it's all about me. We started out by saying, wouldn't it be nice if we learned from other people's mistakes so that we didn't have to go through those same things? And we all laugh because we all know, well, that's not how life works. We always think that we're the exception to the rule, that we're just a little bit smarter than the next guy. We can go a little bit farther and not experience what they experience because we're a little bit stronger or smarter or something along those lines. So then we looked at the smartest guy on the planet, Solomon, and saw how his life was even ruined when he decided to live for himself. Then last week we grabbed this filter and we said, sometimes another mistake that we make is when we speak before we think. And again, we kind of laughed and we thought, have there ever been a time in your life when you said something before you thought about it and then you wish you hadn't said it? A lot of us have funny stories of times when we open up our mouths and as we're even saying it, we're regretting the fact that we're saying it. So we proposed, hey, a way to avoid ruining your life is to filter your words and to grab a filter. And we said the filter is to think before you speak. And we used the THINK as a kind of a strategy for thinking before we speak. And it inevitably will help us, save us from ruining our lives. Now, today we're going to talk about this idea of forgetting to rest. We hear about the Sabbath rest and these kinds of things in church, but how does that really translate into our lives? Because that's another way, it's another pitfall that we can ruin our lives by not resting. And I'm not talking about just going to bed early at night. I'm talking about not fighting the pace that our culture inevitably tries to force us into. Tyler, could you help me this morning? I'm going to need you to come up here, buddy. How you doing? Doing good today? You get your license yet? All right. Well, soon you're going to get your license. All right? And what you're going to do is they're going to give you a set of keys. So I want you to hold those keys. I need to get them back. All right. So you have your set of keys, but with that comes responsibility. All right? You're going to have to get a job because the cars, they cost money. All right? So you stand right there. Cars cost money, insurance costs money, gas costs money. So here's your job. This is your laptop. Don't drop it. All right? You married, Tyler? No? You'll get married soon. And what ends up happening? They make you hold their purse. All right? You look like you're in pretty good shape. You work out? No. Once you get married, you'll have to start working out to keep that shape. All right? So why don't you just start jogging? Can you just start jogging for us? You're doing good. Don't stop. Believe me, if your wife cooks like mine, you need to jog. You know what happens after you get married? Kids. You keep jogging. You don't want to lose your shape. All right. Don't drop them. This is your son. All right? Keep going. You know what sons like to do? Play baseball. You got to find time to play baseball with your son. You know what buddies at work like to do? Play golf. You got to figure out some time to play golf with your buddies. Don't stop jogging. You're going to lose your shape. Then you know what your wife wants to do? She wants you to go to church. So don't forget your Bible. And then when you get to church, the pastor tells you you got to go to a small group too. Keep jogging. So don't forget your small group curriculum. You know what just started at school? Soccer. You got to get your kids practice. If you don't, you're considered a bad dad. So don't forget your soccer ball. All right, keep jogging. I'm just going to preach. How are you making out? Good. Did you even take time to eat today? You know what else the pastor makes you do when you go to church? Get involved in ministry. So don't forget your tambourine so you can help with the worship team. Oh, wait a minute, you're going to miss a soccer practice. Okay, keep jogging. All right. That's what you get to look forward to, son. Give him a hand, will you? Good job, buddy. Now, when you look at these things in and of themselves, none of them are bad. I mean, golf is definitely not bad. Kids are definitely not bad. You know, going to a soccer game or something isn't bad. None of these things in and of themselves are bad. But the reality is we oftentimes find ourselves overwhelmed with the pace that our culture is trying to put upon us. And it's just the reality of life that oftentimes causes us to speed up and have more and more obligations. And this unreasonable pace and forgetting to rest can ruin many areas of our lives. This pace ruins our joy. We can't even enjoy the game that we're at, or we can't even enjoy the golf round that we're at because the guys ahead of us are playing slow, and we know that we've got to get through this round in 4 hours because we've got to make it to a Little League practice or something along these lines. And if you throw in an anniversary or a birthday, it just gets even more complicated and convoluted. The pace ruins us emotionally and physically. Our bodies are not created to handle the kind of pace that our culture demands. It oftentimes ruins us relationally. We don't have time to sit and invest in the relationships that are important to us. The pace often ruins us spiritually. As we talk about, we kid and we tease and say, well, you need to be in church. Then when you get to church, they talk about a small group. And then when they talk about a small group, they talk about getting involved in ministry. But that's on top of oftentimes the Little League, the work commitments, the exercise, all of these other things. We're trying to figure out how do you manage all this stuff? And all of a sudden our spirituality or our spiritual journeys suffer as well because there just isn't time to sit in God's presence. Then you come to church and that's what the pastor says. Be still and sit in God's presence. And we're sitting there going, yeah, right, when? To and from, maybe a practice, when the phone's ringing and the text is going off. I mean, I'm sitting here in prayer this morning, and my phone is blowing up. I got text from a tenant. I got a text from a tenant that's coming. Even during prayer, and you're sitting there going, shut it off, shut it off, shut it off. Let me try to hear from God. But that's the pace oftentimes we find ourselves in, and if we don't cultivate this Sabbath kind of rest intentionally, it could ruin our lives, the pace that we find ourselves in. There's this biblical story that we're going to look at. It involves 3 primary characters: Elijah, King Ahab, and Jezebel. Most of us have heard of at least Jezebel, right? The historical setting is that we're going to paint quickly is that during this time in the life of Israel, the kings had brought the people into idolatry, and it wasn't just one corrupt king, but many corrupt kings, and each one of them became progressively more and more evil, leading God's people into deeper and deeper, more vile levels of sin and corruption. And when things seem like they can't get any worse, King Ahab, marries this pagan woman named Jezebel. And Jezebel made it her life's mission to eradicate all the prophets of God because they defied and came against and challenged the prophets of Baal in which she served. And so she wasn't, up to this point, these evil kings, they were evil, they were corrupt, they were vile, but they didn't dare mess with the prophets of God. They were smart enough to know, all right, I don't agree with them, I'm not going to give them the voice, but I'm not going to come against them. But now all of a sudden Jezebel shows up, and she goes, no, we're not putting up with these prophets of God spouting off all the time and telling us that we're wrong and that we're sinful and that we're vile and these kinds of things. So we're going to eradicate them right off the planet. We're going to kill them. When she went on a mission, one by one, having these prophets killed. And this is when Elijah steps onto the field. That's the setting. It wasn't a real popular time to be saying that I want to be a prophet of God, because it basically said, I'm doing this with a bounty on my head. And so we find this place, and that's where Elijah shows up. Now in your notes in 1 Kings chapter 16, we give the scriptural perspective where it said, Ahab, the son of Omri, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, even more than any of the other kings before him. And then if you skip down to the latter part of verse 33, it said, he did more to provoke the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than any of the other of the kings of Israel before him. So this is the setting in which he shows up, or Elijah shows up. And in the middle of this kind of cat and mouse game, God is protecting Elijah. Jezebel would send somebody to try to find out where he is and try to kill him. God would tell him beforehand, and then Elijah would escape. He was always one or two steps ahead of her because God was protecting him. But it was becoming exhausting. You know, you're constantly looking over your shoulder. You're constantly wondering what's going to be around the next corner and who's going to try to kill him. So finally he gets this instructions from the Lord to go confront Ahab and all these evil prophets of Baal. And so he shows up and he confronts Ahab. And Ahab goes, oh, here's the troublemaker. Finally, we've been looking for you. And Elijah, it's kind of like these two kids in a playground. It's like, I'm not the troublemaker. You're the troublemaker. You're the bad one, not me. And they said, you know what? Once and for all, we're going to settle this. And it's kind of like a scene from an old Western where they say, all right, at high noon at the OK Corral, we're going to have a showdown. Whoever is the real God is going to be the one that will be victorious. You take all of your prophets and you cry out to your God, and you set up a sacrifice, and then I'll set up a sacrifice, and I'll call on my God, and once and for all, we'll figure out who the real God is, and we'll settle this foolishness so I'm not hiding and you're not saying bad things about my God. And so that's what they decide. They agree, and they find a spot to do this. And in 1 Kings chapter 18, that's the agreement they have. And so they decide to sacrifice 2 bulls, the one to the prophet of Baal and one to Elijah's true God. And they all gather together. And this is the scene. And I want you to try to picture it in your mind. They're on this mountain called Carmel. People from all over Israel are gathered. 850 false prophets are there. And Elijah is there. So you get all these prophets of Baal on one side, and then you've got Elijah on the other side by himself. And so they start, these prophets of Baal. They start with their incantations. They start with their cries out to their God. They're starting with dancing, and they begin to cut themselves and do all these kind of pagan rituals, try to invoke the favor of their God, but nothing happens. And I love how Elijah responds. He's like, he begins to mock them. He goes, guys, maybe if you shout louder, maybe your God is a little deaf and he can't hear you. Maybe that's why he's not showing up. Maybe you should start to go a little louder. And so they started to go louder. Oh, maybe he's daydreaming. I mean, after all, God's got a daydream too. So maybe he's daydreaming. You need to do something else to kind of get his attention. Or, Scripture says, this is what Elijah said, maybe he's relieving himself. Maybe he's in the bathroom. Stuff happens. Maybe he's in the bathroom and that's why he hasn't shown up. So maybe if you do some other thing to get his attention or remind him it's worth coming out, and putting down the Reader's Digest and come out and see what's going on. So they got louder. They began to cut themselves with knives and swords, and blood gushed out. It's a morbid scene that they're trying to invoke the response of their God, but nothing happens. Then Elijah, about noontime, he says, that's enough. And he instructs his sacrifice to be covered with water, barrels of water. Matter of fact, dig a trench around the sacrifice and fill it with water too. So there is no secret, there's no smoke and mirrors show. This isn't magic or anything like this. There isn't a trick. I don't have, some kind of fireworks shoved into the mouth of my oxen. And he cried out a simple prayer to God. God, basically, show yourself to be real. And from heaven, fire came down, consumed the altar, and the Bible says even licked up the water that was in the trench. The people recognized that God had shown up. And the entire prophets of Baal were killed. They were chased down and killed. You probably didn't know this kind of stuff was in the Bible, but it was an incredibly violent scene. But God dealt with the idolatry of that nation. Jezebel then hears about what happened at the OK Corral and is not happy. Ahab comes back and says, listen, not only did he humiliate Baal and make fun of your God, he had all of your prophets killed. She went off. And she sent a message to Elijah and said, if I don't have you personally killed by this time tomorrow, may the gods strike me dead. Now that's the setting. And then we find Elijah, after experiencing this amazing victory from God, with this amazing demonstration of God's power, God's favor, God showed up. And then in the next scene, as you continue to read, you see Elijah running, hiding from Jezebel. Now, he just confronted an entire pagan nation and 850 prophets of Baal. And in the next moment, he's running from a woman. Why? You ever thought about that? Well, if you ever met Jezebel, you'd know why. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 3, it says, Elijah was afraid and he fled for his life. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and he left his servant there. And he went alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary tree and prayed that he might die. Then listen to what it says. He says, I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors who have already died. He was simply exhausted at the pace that he was keeping. I mean, it was a great victory, but there was tremendous spiritual battles that was raging. And again, remember, before this, he was constantly dodging her assassins, wondering, and it wore him down. And I think there's some, we may not be being chased by a Jezebel. Maybe somebody isn't trying to hunt us down and kill us. But there's an enemy of our soul that's trying to bring destruction into our life all the time. And it can wear us down. we find ourselves in a culture, if we really want to be honest with ourselves, that is not pro-Christian. It's at the very best post-Christian, and oftentimes anti-Christian. And so we find ourselves oftentimes running against the tide of culture, against the current of popular opinion and behavior, and we find ourselves tired as well already with the demands of just living life with work and family and kids and recreation and trying to stay healthy and all these kinds of things. And oftentimes we find ourselves in places like Elijah did where we say, Lord, I've had enough. I can't take it anymore. Matter of fact, I was talking to a friend this week, and they said, you know what, I've met people that, they say God can't give you more than they can handle. Well, this person's got more than they can handle. So where's God in this? They find themselves in that same place where Elijah's saying, just kill me. I have had enough. What do you do then? How do you respond? See, the mistake we often make is pick yourself up from the bootstraps. Fake it till you make it. Because we're Americans, and in Americans we do. We're New Englanders. We don't need anybody else but ourselves. We're self-sufficient. We're independent. So if, things are difficult, we just work harder and stronger and do it even more so. We're not stubborn, we're tenacious. But the mistake oftentimes that we make that will ruin our lives is forgetting that even God rested. Our kids were flipping through these Bible trivia cards at home the other day. We were quizzing them on their Bible stuff. And they were like, all right, which disciple denied Jesus? And Judas. All right, I said Judas. I got it wrong. Peter denied Jesus. Judas betrayed him. And I was like, that's a trick question. Give me the other one. They all laughed because I got it wrong. But then they're flipping through these things, and they go, all right, how many days did God create the world? I said 7. I got another one wrong. And then my little Sophia, Dad, I thought you were the pastor. Shouldn't you know these things? And immediately, it was just because she was doing them so quick. And immediately I went to 7 days of creation. Well, it wasn't 7 days of creation. It's 6 days of creation. And then the 7th, of course, he rested. But sometimes we forget that. Keep on stepping on your board here. We forget that. So how do we come back? How do we recover? How did Elijah recover? How do we create space in our lives to rest? How do we slow down? How can we realistically insert and carve out times so that we don't get to the place of total exhaustion where we simply just want to give up and quit? 1 Kings chapter 19, it says, then he laid down and he slept under the broom tree. And while he was sleeping, the angel touched him and told him, get up and eat. And he looked around, and there beside his head was some bread and baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and he drank and he laid down again. I'm telling you, one of the most spiritual things sometimes we can do is rest. Is to take a day off. Is to sleep in. Is to unplug. Shut the phone off. Down or shut down the computer. And just rest. We don't like that. It's uncomfortable. The idea of shutting off our phone. What if somebody needs me? Well, they'll get you eventually. To unplug and to simply rest. But it means that, well, I've got to trust God then for my stuff. Yeah. See, sometimes we don't like to rest because really the core issue is the thing that drives us. And oftentimes the thing that drives us is insecurities. We need and want more money. We want to feel important, so we schedule more activities. We want our job, in a sense, we want that feeling like if I don't show up, the place is going to fall apart because I'm so important. I keep this thing together. You know, the other thing a lot of times this busyness, this hectic pace forces us to do? It forces us not to deal with the pain and the hurts of our lives because I don't have time to deal with that stuff. So I medicate my life with busyness and activity instead of addressing the brokenness of our lives that we don't want to face. If I sit and rest, and I sit in God's presence and I'm still like you talk about, then inevitably I got to deal with the junk that I don't want to deal with. But if I'm busy at work, and if I'm busy running from this and that, if my calendar is full, it looks like I'm in demand and I'm important. And I don't have to deal with the reality of those still quiet moments when it's just us and God, and He puts His finger in an area in our lives that is uncomfortable for us to deal with. It's easier to medicate with activity than allow God to deal with the brokenness of our hearts. So we say, well, it's about the kids. I want my kids to experience things that I didn't. I want my kids to have things I never did. And so we drive and we continue and we push. And so we cart our kids from Little League to soccer, to travel soccer, and then we bring them to band, and after band we usher them off to gymnastics, and after gymnastics we run them over to church, and after church we run them over to a kid's birthday party. Because if they miss that girl's birthday party, then they're going to be out of the social circle of third grade, and you don't want that to happen. And then all of a sudden you got to rush them over to this other one, and all of a sudden our kids are tired too. Because we can't afford to be quiet. But that's what Elijah did. In his process of restoration, he sat down and he was quiet. You know, there's a survey done and asked kids what they would want from their moms and dads if they could have anything. And then they quizzed the moms and the dads and they said, what do you think your kids are going to say? And 98% of the moms and dads got it wrong. 98%. Because the moms and dads said, oh, my kids want more time with me. And that's not what the kids said. They don't want more time with you. You know what the kids said? They said, I don't want mom and dad so tired and exhausted when they are with me. Our kids understand we've got commitments, we've got jobs, we've got obligations, there's stuff that needs to be done. They just want, when we are together, Mom and Dad aren't totally spent and totally exhausted, and there's nothing left in the tank for them. The psalmist says, it's useful for you to work so hard from early morning until late at night, anxiously working for food to eat, for God gives rest to His loved ones. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't work hard. I'm saying there needs to be balance, and there needs to be opportunities for rest in order for us not to ruin our lives and the relationships that are found within it. And then after that, an angel of the Lord basically tells Elijah to get up, you've eaten, you've been strengthened, now eat again, refuel your body, and head back to the mountain of God. And again, the other thing that's going to restore our lives and keep us from ruining our lives is spending some time in God's presence. And I know this isn't easy to do, because of the pace in which we live. But God gave us a model with His creation. He gave us then the instruction with the Sabbath, and we see it all throughout the Scripture. You can't go 24/7 all the time without a break. Matter of fact, the French learned this during the French Revolution. They outlawed Sundays as a day of rest, because they wanted the people working. They wanted to move forward in this revolution and all of that. But they've discovered that the entire nation of France, their health had collapsed within a year. So then they mandated a day of rest to try to turn it back around. We need those quiet emotional times. We need those times where we can unplug and just do things that will restore us in God's presence. We say, well, that's an Old Testament thing. You talk about creation, that's God, and that's an Old Testament thing. The Sabbath, that's a thing of the law, that's a thing of the past. All right, well then, if you're a New Testament kind of guy, let's look at who's our example in the New Testament. Let's look at Jesus then. Before He chose the 12 disciples, He spent the entire night alone in the desert hills, Luke records. When he received a word about John the Baptist's death, his first cousin, that basically he was beheaded because of his relationship with his cousin, it says that he withdrew from there on a boat to a lonely place, Matthew 14. After feeding the 5,000, Jesus went into the hills by himself. That was a big deal. That was a miraculous event. Yet Jesus had expended, and so he went into the hills to recharge his battery and to sit in the presence of his Father. Following a long night of work, in the morning, a great while before day, Jesus rose and went to a lonely place, Mark 1. When the 12 returned from preaching in a healing mission that Jesus had sent them on, he then instructed them and said, "Come away by yourself to a lonely place," Mark 6. Following the healing of a leper, Jesus withdrew himself to the wilderness to pray. Before the cross, where was Jesus? He was praying in the solitude of Gethsemane. We see it over and over in the life of Christ. Before major events or decisions, after major healings, after major confrontations, he would withdraw and rest for a season to be in the presence of his Father. Are we any better than Christ? Yet we think we can. We think we can just go and go and go and never withdraw, and never have our batteries charged. It's a mistake. It will ruin your life if you ignore rest. And then after that, we see Elijah being instructed. You've got work that still needs to be done. I'm not going to kill you. I'm not going to take your life. I'm not going to give up on you, Elijah. There are kings that need to be anointed. There are prophets that need to be trained. There's still a work for you to be done. And so sometimes I think part of this understanding of sitting back and resting, we can get a new priorities in our lives and revisit our purpose in which God has called us to. There's a reason that we're on this planet. God has purpose for our lives. And the problem is oftentimes we're carrying too much stuff, as we saw, to add something else. But when we know God's purpose for our lives, it's easier to say no to good things that don't facilitate the purpose in which we've been called. See, there's a lot of good things that we can be engaged in and do. It's not that we say no to just to the bad things. Sometimes there's really good things that vie for our attention and our time and our efforts that are good, but they're not good for us because they don't facilitate the purpose in which God has called us to. So knowing God's purpose clearly enables us to take the energies that we do have and the time that we do have and put it in those areas so that we can be most effective for the kingdom's work. In 1965, there was a Senate subcommittee that claimed that the future looked bright for free time in America. You know why they thought this in 1965? They said by 1985, this was going to be America. Americans would be working 22 hours a day, and that's it. Do you know why? 22 hours a week, I'm sorry. No. In 1965, a Senate subcommittee said the future is bright for free time in America. They said the most an American will work by 1985 is 22 hours a week. Do you know why? What were they envisioning? What were they seeing that was going to create such ease in our lives? Technology, computers. They said because of computers and robots and all these kinds of things that were coming, we would be able to sit back and enjoy and let the computers do the work. We find ourselves now a little bit different. They said, no, it's going to help housewives and moms because we'll have microwaves, quick fix food, food processors. It's going to be a carefree future. The office, computers are going to replace stenographs and steno machines and typewriters. Some of you guys don't even know what those things are. I was talking to my daughter about that. She goes, no, I know what a typewriter is. We learned about that, Daddy, in history class. I was like, you got to be kidding me. However, the average amount of leisure time has shrunk since that time, 37%. The average week work now is increased to 47 hours a week. And if you did 47 hours this week, you'd probably be thinking you're on vacation. We're thinking, 47 hours? Awesome. I would take that anytime. The reality is, we found other things to stuff in those times of our lives, more work, more pleasure, more leisure, instead of more rest. There's a book by Richard Foster. It's entitled The Celebration of Discipline. It really talks about this idea of the spiritual disciplines and how a follower of Christ, when you embrace these disciplines, help you become a little bit more like Christ as a result. And in that book, he writes this: in contemporary society, our adversary majors in three things: noise, hurry, and crowds. If he can keep us engaged in muchness, in manyness, he will rest satisfied. Proverbs says an impulsive vow is a trap. Later you wish you could get out of it. You ever said yes and you wish you didn't? An impulsive yes is a trap in a sense. We've got to begin to learn to say no to good things, create times of rest, lest our lives be ruined by the pace our culture is on. There's a reason God himself rested. There's a reason why Jesus himself carved out times of solitude in lonely places. There's also a reason at the end of temptation of Christ. In Luke chapter 4, the scripture says that after the enemy couldn't derail Jesus and tempt him, it says that the devil left him until an opportune time. See, there are times in our lives that we're good. But the opportune time for most of us is like Elijah when we're fatigued. You want to avoid some of the snares and the traps of the enemy? Don't ruin your life by ignoring rest, so that those opportune times for the enemy are few and far between. Let's pray.